Imagine being told you're supposed to be prohibited from owning anything, speaking publicly, or even selecting your attire, all solely based on being female. Welcome to medieval Europe, a period where men established all the regulations, frequently broke their own rules, and yet somehow considered themselves the sensible ones. Spoiler alert, they were not. Regarding these power-obsessed medieval men, medieval Europe wasn't opposed to merely a male-dominated society. It was the original no girls allowed clubhouse, except this clubhouse encompassed every castle, church, and position of authority across an entire continent. While contemporary workplace discrimination might result in a strongly worded email from human resources, medieval discrimination was literally codified into law, enforced by armies, and sanctioned by the Pope himself. Let us first discuss kings. These individuals wore elaborate crowns, occupied thrones reportedly fashioned from actual swords, and wielded absolute power over everyone in Napoleon's lives. No woman ruled medieval England in her own right until Mary the Front in 1553, and even then, her ascension to the throne was met with widespread disbelief and opposition. Many of these kings possessed limited literacy, while their wives and sisters were often multilingual and managed entire royal households. Yet the idea of a woman holding the crown herself was considered unacceptable. It opposed akin to a CEO who cannot use email while the entire company is effectively run by their assistant, who is fluent in 5 languages and holds multiple degrees. The lords were equally problematic. These figures were essentially medieval landlords, but instead of neglecting to fix a leaky faucet, they controlled entire regions and held life or death power over peasants. A revealing statistic from 13th century records indicates that male nobles inherited property 98% of the time, even if they had older, more intelligent sisters. Imagine being passed over for a promotion because your younger brother can burp the alphabet. That was essentially what medieval noblewomen faced, and these lords weren't exactly shouldering the workload. Many spent the majority of their time hunting, feasting, or engaging in minor conflicts, while their wives covertly managed affairs to prevent everything from collapsing. Knights, those supposedly honorable defenders of chivalry, represented another layer of complexity. While they composed poetry celebrating women-opposed beauty and competed in tournaments displaying their ladies-impose favors, much of this was for show. In medieval tournaments, knights would often wear a piece of their lady-oppose clothing as a good luck charm, typically a sleeve or a veil. Nothing quite says true love like wearing your girlfriend oppose sleeve while attempting to unseat other men from horses with a pointed stick. And it opposed important not to overlook that these same romantic knights readily enforced laws that treated women as property. The political system was a particularly disheartening aspect. No woman could vote, although it was worth noting that most men could not vote either. However, women were often excluded from town meetings in many areas. There is a humorous record from a French town in 1267 where a woman attempted to speak at a public gathering. The local officials were so shocked that they debated for 3 days whether to exile her or simply fine her family. They ultimately chose the fine because, believe it or not, they feared exile would grant her too much freedom to travel. Imagine being so threatened by a woman oppose's opinion that a 3-day conference is required to determine her punishment for expressing one. Speaking of travel, noble women were essentially under house arrest. They could only leave their homes with permission from their male guardians and typically required an escort. One resourceful noblewoman in 14th century Yorkshire circumvented this by convincing her husband she needed to go on frequent pilgrimages. She actually utilized these religious journeys to manage her own clandestine trading business. When her husband eventually discovered her activities, he was so impressed by the amount of money she had earned that he pretended not to notice. Sometimes the most qualified individual for a task was undeniably a woman. The church was particularly effective at suppressing women opposed these roles while claiming it was for their own well-being. Priests would preach about women and opposers' delicate nature and their need for protection, while simultaneously portraying them as temptresses capable of corrupting men and non-opposite souls. Talk about mixed messages. Idanaposon are akin to telling someone they oppose were too frail to open a jar, but possess enough strength to seemingly dismantle civilization with their feminine charm. These religious leaders would dedicate hours to composing detailed regulations, outlining what women were prohibited from doing, which begs the question of whether they had any other interests. Speaking of decisions, the creativity displayed by medieval legal systems in keeping women in their place is truly remarkable. The rules were so convoluted, they would make a pretzel look straightforward. The legal system of medieval Europe might accurately have been termed rules for men, with suggestions for when men feel inclined to follow them. You know how people say justice is blind? Well, medieval justice wasn't merely blind. It was deaf, mute, and unequivocally biased against anyone wearing a dress. If Lady Justice had been a real figure back then, she likely would have peeked from under her blindfold just to ensure her ruling was against the woman. The courts possessed an incredible talent for contorting logic. Women were barred from testifying in major court cases, deemed unreliable witnesses. Yet they were somehow considered reliable enough to be punished for crimes. One unfortunate woman in France was fined for giving false testimony before she even uttered a word. The judge simply assumed she would lie because, well, she was a woman. Talk about a rigged system. The only instances where women opposed to us testimony was completely accepted were when they were confessing to crimes. Funny how that worked out. Here's an actual case from 1342 England. A woman named Agnes brought her husband to court, accusing him of stealing her inheritance. The judge's response? He fined her for wasting the court's time because, in his view, a wife's property automatically belonged to her husband anyway. It's like complaining that someone stole your wallet, only to be told that your wallet naturally belongs to the thief. Makes perfect sense, right? The court records show Agnes was compelled to pay a fine of 40 shillings, approximately 6 months' wages for a skilled worker, for daring to question her husband's entitlement to everything she possessed. There was an incredible case from 1356 where a merchant in Bastur's widow attempted to claim ownership of her own shop after his death. The court informed her that since the business had been in her husband's name during the marriage, it legally belonged to his family, even though she had managed it alone for 20 years while he was finding himself on various pilgrimages. She lost her entire livelihood because medieval law could not grasp the concept that women might actually be competent at running businesses. But wait, it gets worse. Women could be convicted of crimes, but they couldn't defend themselves in court. They required a male relative to speak on their behalf, because obviously a woman couldn't pause to possibly explain her own actions better than some uncle who wasn't even present. Records show that in one town a woman was accused of stealing bread. Her defense was that she had actually purchased it and had witnesses to prove it. However, since her husband was away and her brother was too busy to attend court, she was found guilty by default. The punishment? Working in the accuser opposite's bakery for free for 6 months. Medieval justice at its finest. The punishment system was equally absurd. Men who committed crimes could often avoid harsher penalties by paying fines. Women, not so much. They faced public humiliation, such as being submerged in rivers or forced to wear signs detailing their crimes. One court record from 1374 shows a woman compelled to walk through town wearing a sign that declared, "I dared to argue with my husband about cheese." The actual crime here was clearly the husband in-law's inability to tolerate dairy-related criticism. Another woman had to stand in the town square for 3 hours holding a sheep because she had suggested her husband's wool prices were too high. Inheritance laws were another masterpiece of inequity. The basic rule was simple. Men inherited everything. A daughter could be the oldest, most intelligent, and capable child. But if she had a baby brother, tough luck. All family property would go to him, even if he was too young to distinguish between a castle and a sandcastle. The most infuriating part is that when women did attempt to legally challenge these injustices, they were frequently accused of being troublemakers or witches. Therein is the reason why medieval court records show more women accused of witchcraft than any other crime. It was the medieval equivalent of demanding to speak to the manager, except instead of potentially getting a refund, you might be burned at the stake. Records show that women who initiated multiple court cases. You wouldn't have us to believe how the medieval economy was intentionally structured to keep women impoverished and dependent. When it came to earning a livelihood, medieval women faced more obstacles than a poorly designed assault course. Let us discuss the daily reality of medieval women's lives. They were incredibly demanding. Imagine juggling a dozen different tasks while adhering to strict social regulations and somehow managing to make it all work. And indeed, they worked extensively in ways that many historical accounts tend to overlook. First off, regarding employment, forget the notion that women solely stayed home and embroidered cushions. Medieval women were significant participants in numerous industries, particularly beer brewing. That's right, until the 1500s, most beer brewers were women, known as alewives. Records from one town in 1375 indicate that 78% of licensed brewers were women. They were renowned for their meticulous attention to detail, particularly in keeping their equipment clean, which often resulted in higher quality beer. Farming constituted another significant part of women-opposed lives. Everyone in medieval families had to contribute to the farm and opposed operation, and women played a vital role. They planted crops, raised animals, and managed daily farm tasks alongside their other duties. Records from one English village show women performing 70% of the field work while also managing household affairs. One fascinating record mentions a woman who managed to harvest an entire field while simultaneously breastfeeding twins and supervising 3 toddlers. Now that opposed multitasking. Speaking of households, let us talk about children. The average medieval woman bore around 5 to 7 children, assuming she survived childbirth. However, here is the interesting aspect. They often raised significantly more than that. Due to high death rates, many women ended up taking in orphaned relatives, stepchildren, or apprentices. One household record from 1389 shows a woman raising 12 children, 3 of her own, 4 stepchildren, 2 orphaned nieces, and 3 apprentices. She reportedly kept track of everyone by assigning them different colored threads to wear, a medieval version of name tags. Women devised innovative methods for managing these large households. They would create informal childcare networks, taking turns watching each other and apos children while others worked. One village actually had a system where women would rotate baby feeding duties, medieval daycare complete with built-in lunch service. They even developed a complex scheduling system using notches on sticks, as most were unable to read or write, primitive project management at its finest. Their career options were surprisingly diverse. Women ran markets, worked as healers, and even participated in construction. Yes, construction. Records show women working as carpenters, plasterers, and even assisting in building cathedrals. One woman in York became so renowned for her stonework that she trained several apprentices, both male and female, in her techniques. The textile industry was another area where women excelled. Spinning, weaving, and making clothes were serious business ventures, not just household chores. A skilled spinner could earn enough to support her family, and many women became successful cloth merchants. The intricate nature of the work demanded patience and skill, and many women passed these specialized techniques down through generations. Perhaps the most impressive aspect was how women created their own economic networks. They would trade services, share resources, and support each other in ways that often didn't involve money. Need childcare? Trade some eggs. Want someone to teach your daughter to read? Exchange some wool. One record mentions a woman paying for her son's education by teaching the teacher's wife how to make cheese. These informal economies helped communities thrive and demonstrated impressive business acumen. Here's a fascinating statistic. In one French town, records show that women were involved in over 200 different types of work. They were bakers, butchers, candle makers, rope makers, and more. While they often had to work within the social constraints of their time, they found ways to pursue various careers and contribute to their community's economic life. Life certainly wasn't easy. Between managing households, raising children, and handling various jobs, medieval women had their hands full. But they created strong support networks and developed efficient systems to get everything done. Church gatherings, for instance, became opportunities to exchange news, share tips, and arrange trades, combining social, spiritual, and practical needs in one setting. The day-to-day reality for medieval women was complex. While they faced many restrictions, they also found ways to be productive members of society and often gained respect in their communities through their skills and hard work. Records show numerous cases of women being praised for their business acumen, healing abilities, or craft skills. Medieval women developed a remarkable set of skills out of necessity. Many could brew beer, deliver babies, manage farms, run businesses, and raise large families, sometimes all concurrently. They were adept at finding practical solutions to daily challenges and maximizing opportunities. This practicality, resourcefulness, An ability to make things work despite obstacles truly defined medieval women's lives. For every illuminated manuscript depicting a woman in quiet contemplation, there were countless others actively participating in medieval economic and social life. Finding ways to thrive within their society, oppose, is framework. These women weren't opposed just surviving. They were often the backbone of medieval communities, contributing their skills, knowledge, and labor to keep society functioning smoothly. But the economy was not in their favor. The economy resembled a rigged game of Monopoly where women weren't even allowed to roll the dice. Desire to start a business? Sorry, male permission required. Want to keep your earnings? Nope, they belong to your husband. Want to inherit property? Better hope you possess a time machine to transport you to the 21st century. The entire system was designed to keep women's purses as empty as a medieval lord imposed promises. Let us examine the figures because they are astonishing. Records from a 1378 English town indicate that women were paid precisely half of what men earned for performing identical work. Half, and this wasn't opposed to merely an unwritten custom. It was formally enshrined in guild regulations. One document literally stated, "A woman in Monster's work being naturally inferior shall be compensated at half the rate of a man opposed." The sole exception, if a woman could prove she was better at the job than any available man. The catch? She had to prove it to a panel of men who would lose money if they admitted she was superior. Talk about a conflict of interest. It did not oppose like asking turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving. The tax system was another testament to medieval unfairness. Women-owned businesses were taxed at higher rates because, unbelievably, they were deemed unusual and therefore suspicious. A female baker in York had to pay 3 times the tax of her male competitor, even though her bread won every local competition. Her response? She started selling her bread through her 10-year-old son. Suddenly, the tax reverted to normal rates because apparently a child was considered more trustworthy than a skilled adult woman. The tax records actually list her business as John and Pa's bread, even though young John could barely reach the oven. The property game was even worse. Women technically could own land, but good luck retaining it. Records from 1365 detail a woman inheriting a farm from her aunt, only for the local lord to declare it improper for a woman to own so much land. His solution? He would help her manage it. By help, he meant taking all the profits while leaving her with all the work. It opposed constantly, like having a business partner who takes your money but expects you to do their taxes. She ultimately had to marry her farmhand simply to retain a small portion of her own property. Banking was another challenge. Women could not obtain loans without a male guarantor, yet they were fully liable for their husband's debts. One unfortunate woman in 1392 was forced to pay off her husband's gambling debts by selling her prize cow collection. Yes, medieval people collected cows. They were akin to the collectibles of their time. When she finally settled all debts, her husband celebrated by taking out another loan. Court records show she eventually resolved this problem by informing every moneylender in town that her husband was actually her mentally confused uncle. Medieval problems demanded medieval solutions. The most absurd aspect was how they rationalized all this economic discrimination. Women were deemed incapable of handling money because they were too emotional, yet records show male merchants regularly engaged in sword fights over minor price disagreements. Women were considered too weak to run businesses, yet they were somehow strong enough to perform grueling farm work. Women were deemed too simple to understand finances, yet they were often the ones preventing their households from bankruptcy while their husbands purchased yet another unnecessary sword. One account details a wife carefully managing her family appos, U.S. finances for 20 years, while her husband invested their savings in a foolproof plan to locate mermaids. But you know what happens when you restrict someone for an extended period? They become exceptionally skilled at finding ways to circumvent the rules. And medieval women, they transformed outsmarting the system into an art form. Being clever wasn't merely an advantage for medieval women, it was a matter of survival. When men create every rule in the book, you either learn to read between the lines or be crushed by them. And medieval women became so adept at finding loopholes, they could have taught modern legal professionals a thing or two. Medieval records are full of instances where women turned adversity into opportunity, usually while the men were too preoccupied with self-congratulation to notice. Take education, for example. Girls were supposedly prohibited from learning to read, as it might expose them to dangerous ideas. However, noble women needed to manage household accounts, so they convinced everyone that learning numbers wasn't actually reading. One clever noblewoman taught her entire household to read by claiming she was simply teaching them to count prayer beads. By the time anyone realized her servants were better educated than most priests, she even started a trend of prayer counting classes that spread through 3 counties before the church realized they had inadvertently created an underground literacy network. The business world saw some particularly ingenious solutions. Since women could not pose to officially operate shops, they became exceptionally good at running them unofficially. Records from 1367 detail a manipose business that was mysteriously only open when his wife was present. The husband spent most of his time napping in the back room while his wife handled all the work. But technically, it was his shop. When customers inquired why he seemed unaware of his own business, he claimed he was practicing delegation. Medieval management at its finest. The wife eventually started charging people extra to wake him up for questions, creating medieval Europe's first consulting fee. Some women developed even more creative workarounds. One brilliant individual in 18th century London managed her entire merchant empire through a network of cats. Yes, cats. She trained them to follow specific trade routes, carrying messages hidden in their collars. Local guards never suspected the cats, who would suspect a feline of operating an international trading network. When she was finally apprehended, court records show more confusion than anger. One judge actually asked if the cat should also be put on trial. She was acquitted with a warning because no one could figure out how to define illegal feline commerce in Latin. The notion that women are too emotional frequently backfired spectacularly. Since everyone expected women to be dramatic, they could often get away with outrageous behavior that would have landed men in serious trouble. Records show a woman who avoided paying taxes by bursting into tears and wailing about her poor little chickens whenever the tax collector appeared. He was so uncomfortable with female emotions that he would leave without collecting. She maintained this tactic for 12 years. Her poor little chickens likely owned half the town by then. The best part? She didn't even own chickens. The truly intelligent women exploited menopause as egos. They would praise their husbands for brilliant ideas that were actually their own, manage entire estates while pretending to offer minimal assistance, and resolve major problems while making men believe they had figured it out themselves. A woman in 1382 fixed her town's entire water supply system but convinced everyone it was her intellectually challenged brother, Apos' idea, because they preferred to believe a man was secretly a genius rather than admit a woman understood engineering. She later used the same technique to redesign the town's defensive walls, cure a cattle plague, and invent a new type of plow, all credited to various male relatives who could barely dress themselves. Statistics provide compelling evidence. In towns where women were barred from owning property, there's a noticeable number of businesses owned by sickly men whose wives were required to handle all affairs. In one French village, 60% of male business owners were reportedly too delicate to manage their own enterprises. Either medieval men were remarkably frail, or medieval women were exceptionally adept at working the system. One town in Europe's records document an epidemic of masculine frailty that mysteriously affected only men whose wives were proficient in mathematics. However, perhaps the most impressive achievement was how they transmitted these skills across generations. Mothers instructed daughters in the art of feigning ignorance while possessing intelligence, of adhering to rules while subtly breaking them, and of smiling sweetly while outmaneuvering the men who underestimated them. One household tips book from 1375 is actually a coded manual for circumventing male authority. Its recipe for sweet bread contains instructions for concealing money from one of Nepos' husband. The section on proper flower arrangement includes detailed directions for operating a clandestine business. Even the embroidery patterns were actually maps indicating safe routes for female travelers. All this mental agility had an interesting consequence. Medieval women became remarkably skilled at reading people and situations. When you have to outsmart half the population just to navigate your day, you develop formidable abilities. Some historians argue that medieval women essentially pioneered psychology not because they were inherently more emotional, but because they were compelled to become experts at managing male egos simply to survive. Speaking of marriage, the innovative methods women devise for handling being legally considered their husband's possession is property are hard to believe. Let us just say that being someone and year's property functions far more effectively when that someone is unaware of what they actually own. Marriage in medieval times was about as romantic as a business contract, because that is precisely what it was. Your father would essentially auction you off to the highest bidder, and voila, you became someone opposed wife. However, there was one potential escape route that many women secretly hoped for: becoming a widow. Certainly not an ideal path to freedom, but when your options are restricted to being property or being free, you work with the hand unipas were dealt. And indeed, medieval women exploited that system with remarkable skill. The statistics tell a compelling story. In one English town in 1385, records show that widows owned 40% of all businesses, despite constituting only 15% of the population. Meanwhile, married women owned precisely 0 businesses, as legally they were prohibited from owning anything. One widow actually purchased her late husband's business at auction, the very same business she had managed for him for 20 years while he spent their money on hunting dogs. Court records note that she paid for it with funds she had secretly saved while claiming her husband's trousers required continuous expensive repairs. Widows possessed privileges that married women could only dream of. They could own property, operate businesses, enter into contracts, and, here is the key point, refuse to remarry. This last right was hugely significant. Records show some younger widows practically raced to establish their businesses before their families could marry them off again. One clever widow in France launched a mourning accessories business. Knowing nobody would pressure a professional mourner to remarry, it would simply be considered in poor taste. She became so successful that other widows started imitating her idea, giving rise to what historians term the medieval widow fashion industry. This newfound freedom was so highly valued that some women became quite inventive in attaining widowhood status. There is a remarkable court record from 1392 where a woman convinced her elderly husband to become a monk. He spent his final years in peaceful prayer. She gained her independence, and everyone pretended it was a purely pious act and not at all a clever scheme for effectively obtaining a divorce. Medieval problems required medieval solutions. Another woman persuaded her husband that managing their business was undermining his masculine dignity. Consequently, he nobly transferred all control to her and spent his days composing poetry about his supposed busyness. The statistics are astounding. In one German town in 1387, every single woman accused of witchcraft had either refused marriage, inherited property, or knew how to read. Suspicious indeed. The town records show that the local judge wrote, "The more independent the woman, the more likely she deals with the devil," because clearly the only way a woman could support herself was through satanic book clubs. They even imposed a special tax on single women called the witch risk fee, essentially charging women for the crime of not having a man to control them. And speaking of lasting effects, you wouldn't believe how many of these medieval ideas about controlling women have subtly seeped into modern times. Sure, those medieval rules concerning women are ancient history, as outdated as your great-aunt his fashion choices, right? Wrong. Many of those old ideas have persisted longer than that peculiar gelatin salad recipe from the 1950s, and some continue to cause issues today, much like that one relative who insists on discussing politics at Thanksgiving dinner. Let's engage in a bit of time travel. Women couldn't own property in medieval times, and believe it or not, in some parts of America, women couldn't just obtain credit cards without their husband's permission until 1974. That's correct. Your grandmother might have found it easier to purchase a castle in 1374 than to get a MasterCard in 1974. At least medieval women could pay for things with chickens. The workplace also provides a prime example of lingering medieval thinking. Remember how medieval guilds implemented special rules to exclude women from certain trades? Fast forward to 1973, when women were still prohibited from becoming airline pilots in most countries. The justification? Women are too emotional to fly planes because apparently men never lose their composure, except when their favorite sports team loses, or someone takes their parking spot, or their sandwich has the wrong kind of mustard. The education gap is particularly striking. Medieval individuals believed women's brains would literally explode if they acquired too much knowledge. While we're not quite that extreme anymore, until the 1970s, many top universities refused to admit women because it might distract male students, as if men required assistance getting distracted. They were managing perfectly well on their own. Thank you very much. The gender pay gap also has medieval roots. Back then, women were compensated at half the rate of men because their work was considered inherently inferior. Today, women still earn less on average, although we now employ more sophisticated language to justify it. Instead of stating that women oppose work is less valuable, we attribute it to factors like market forces and career choices. It's the same old medieval concept, just with a different veneer. Even modern marriage laws retain some medieval DNA. Until surprisingly recently, husbands couldn't be legally charged with raping their wives in many countries. This was because, as in medieval times, wives were considered property. This situation didn't push to change in all U.S. states until 1993. This means that people younger than some pairs of genes were born before women had full legal protection from their husbands. What's insidious is how these archaic ideas resurface in new guises. For instance, when companies claim they cannot promote women to leadership positions because they might become pregnant and depart, inequality. It's merely a contemporary version of medieval guilds asserting that women couldn't become master craftsmen because they might marry and relocate. The excuses may have become more polished, but the underlying sentiment remains the same. However, here posts the encouraging part. Just as medieval women discovered ways to circumvent those rigid rules, modern women continue to challenge these outdated notions. Every time someone asserts women can do that, another woman proceeds to do it anyway, and often does it better, simply to make a point. The lesson from all of this medieval absurdity is that progress is not a linear trajectory. Inequality is more like attempting to walk home after consuming too much meat, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, occasionally falling into a ditch, but eventually reaching the destination. So the next time someone says, that Napa's just the way things are, remember they probably expressed the same sentiment in 1386. And those medieval women would likely observe us today and comment, not bad, but there are still work to be done.